The first light of December 8, 1941, spilled over the horizon like an indifferent witness to a world suddenly on fire. Thousands of miles away from the smoking wreckage of Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval commanders convened in dimly lit rooms, maps sprawled across tables, tension thick in the air. They had struck the United States with a blow calculated to stun, to cripple, and to buy precious time. But the attack was only the beginning. Japan's gaze now stretched far beyond Hawaii, across the Pacific Ocean, toward the islands and resource-rich lands of Southeast Asia. The objective was clear: secure fuel, rubber, and minerals, expand the empire, and solidify national morale through rapid, decisive victories. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, knew the implications of the campaign. The American fleet might recover, the Allies might retaliate, but Japan's strategy hinged on momentum. Swift action in Southeast Asia could cripple British, Dutch, and American positions before reinforcements arrived. His subordinates, each aware of the stakes, understood that miscalculation could mean disaster not just militarily, but politically. Japan's leadership sought not only land and resources but also the psychological edge, demonstrating the might of the empire to both its enemies and its own citizens. By mid-morning, reconnaissance reports from planes launched at dawn confirmed that American carriers had not yet appeared, leaving the Pacific temporarily unchallenged. In Tokyo, government officials celebrated the success of the Pearl Harbor operation, but the strategists were already moving forward, mapping out the next objectives: Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. Each target was chosen not at random but for its strategic and economic significance. Malaya, with its rubber plantations, was vital for military supplies. The Dutch East Indies promised oil reserves critical for fueling the naval expansion that Japan envisioned. And the Philippines represented a symbolic and strategic barrier, a stepping stone for further incursions into the Pacific theater. Japanese troops prepared quietly but efficiently for the march southward. Air squadrons practiced rapid strikes on simulated targets, infantry units rehearsed amphibious landings, and armored divisions were readied for combat in tropical terrain. Coordination between Army and Navy was meticulous. The success of operations depended on flawless timing and execution. Any misalignment between sea and land forces could give the Allies the opportunity to regroup, so communication lines, supply chains, and reconnaissance missions were treated as seriously as combat drills. Meanwhile, morale played an equally critical role in the plan. The Japanese government and military understood that victories had to resonate not only on the battlefield but also in the hearts of their citizens. Propaganda campaigns extolled the inevitability of Japanese dominance in Asia, portraying the campaign as a liberation of Asian nations from Western colonial powers. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers reinforced the narrative that Japan was both protector and conqueror, bringing order where the West had supposedly imposed chaos. Soldiers marching toward foreign shores were reminded constantly that they carried the pride and destiny of the empire with them. By afternoon, fleets began to disperse from staging areas near Japan's southern islands, each group assigned to a specific target. Aircraft carriers led the way, launching scout planes to identify Allied positions and relay crucial intelligence. Battleships and cruisers followed, forming protective screens and artillery support for upcoming landings. Submarines slipped silently through the waters, tasked with cutting off supply lines and intercepting any Allied naval reinforcements. Every movement was calculated to achieve maximum surprise and efficiency, a continuation of the tactical philosophy demonstrated at Pearl Harbor. The first challenge was Malaya, whose dense jungles and coastal fortifications promised difficult engagements. Japanese planners, however, had anticipated these obstacles. Amphibious landing rehearsals had prepared troops for rapid disembarkation, while engineers carried explosives and tools to clear pathways and disable enemy defenses. Air support was coordinated meticulously. Bombers would soften fortifications and destroy airfields, while fighter planes provided cover for advancing infantry. Japanese commanders knew that speed was crucial. Prolonged engagements would allow British forces to mobilize reinforcements, undermining the momentum that Japan relied upon. Simultaneously, naval intelligence teams monitored Allied communications closely. Every intercepted message, every ship sighting, and every reconnaissance report could alter the course of the operation. Japanese cryptographers worked tirelessly to decode messages, and commanders adjusted plans based on the intelligence received. This attention to detail reflected a broader strategic philosophy. Dominance was not achieved by brute force alone but by anticipation, coordination, and precision. As the sun dipped lower over the Pacific, signaling the approach of the first night of the campaign, Japanese soldiers on ships and islands prepared for a journey that would take them far from home. They were armed not only with weapons but with the conviction that their actions were part of a historic mission. The vast expanse of the ocean ahead symbolized both opportunity and danger, territories rich in resources, strategic airfields, and the promise of imperial glory, juxtaposed against the risk of unexpected resistance, treacherous waters, and the looming presence of Allied forces. By the evening, the first landing units were nearing the coast of northern Malaya. Their orders were precise: seize airfields, capture ports, and neutralize opposition swiftly. Paratroopers were ready to descend behind enemy lines, engineers prepared to disable defenses, and infantry units braced for jungle warfare. The operation demanded coordination, courage, and a relentless drive to exploit the element of surprise. Every hour counted, every misstep could jeopardize the broader plan, and every soldier understood that the outcome would shape the next phase of the war. Back in Tokyo, government officials awaited reports with bated breath. Pearl Harbor had been the spark, but the flame needed to spread. Success in Southeast Asia would provide Japan not only with the resources needed to sustain its military ambitions but also with the psychological momentum to continue pressing westward. Each captured airfield, each subdued town, and each destroyed Allied ship was a testament to the Empire's meticulous planning and unwavering resolve. By the end of the first day, Japanese forces had made their initial landings with minimal resistance, setting the stage for further advances into the Pacific. The strategy was unfolding as intended, securing resources, destabilizing enemy positions, and demonstrating dominance to both domestic and foreign audiences. Yet, commanders knew that challenges loomed ahead: Allied reinforcements, unpredictable terrain, and the resilience of local populations threatened to complicate even the most carefully laid plans. The dawn of December 8, 1941, marked more than a single act of aggression. It signaled the start of a calculated expansion that would reshape the Pacific. Japan's strategy, combining military precision, resource acquisition, and psychological warfare, was now fully in motion. As ships sailed toward Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, the stage was set for a series of campaigns that would push the Allies to their limits and test the resolve of a nation determined to assert its power across the Pacific. The march southward. The morning mist hung low over the Malayan coastline as Japanese warships sliced through calm waters with a silent menace. For the soldiers on board, there was no room for hesitation. Every hour that passed without action allowed the Allies to fortify positions, call reinforcements, or disrupt supply lines. The precision and speed that had defined Pearl Harbor were now being applied to a far larger canvas: the conquest of Southeast Asia. Amphibious landings, air superiority, and coordinated assaults were no longer theoretical exercises, they were the lifeline of a campaign that would determine Japan's access to vital resources and its credibility as a regional power. The first waves of troops approached the beaches with a tense mix of anticipation and calculation. Officers barked orders, adjusting landing craft positions to avoid natural obstacles, coral reefs, and shallow sandbars. Reconnaissance had mapped enemy defenses, but intelligence could never capture the chaos of combat. Soldiers rehearsed their roles silently, knowing that any hesitation could trigger failure. In the dense jungles just beyond the shore, British and Indian forces waited, aware that their defenses were incomplete but determined to resist. From the sky, Japanese bombers and fighters coordinated with the landing units, executing a series of rapid strikes on airfields, coastal fortifications, and communication centers. The strategy was not simply to destroy enemy positions but to paralyze coordination, sow confusion, and maintain the momentum that had propelled Japan from victory to victory. Fighter planes strafed defensive positions while bombers neutralized artillery batteries, creating gaps for infantry to exploit. Every mission was a delicate balance between aggression and caution. Pilots had to avoid overextension while ensuring maximum disruption. The landing itself was a feat of synchronization. Engineers disembarked first, clearing obstacles and establishing makeshift supply points. Infantry followed, moving with careful precision through the shallow surf toward beaches strewn with debris and hidden traps. The roar of artillery, the whistle of shells, and the sporadic crack of rifle fire filled the air, but the Japanese units advanced methodically. Each battalion had been trained to respond to unexpected resistance, and every officer knew the importance of maintaining communication with both naval and air support. The success of the operation relied on seamless coordination, a lesson seared into every soldier by months of preparation. In the interior, the jungles presented an entirely different challenge. Thick undergrowth, torrential rains, and uneven terrain slowed progress, but Japanese forces were equipped and trained for tropical warfare. Small units moved in disciplined formations, using hand signals and radios to coordinate ambushes and flanking maneuvers. Engineers laid improvised bridges and cleared paths, ensuring that artillery and supplies could follow the infantry. Local populations observed silently, some fleeing the approaching army while others were coerced into aiding navigation or labor. Japan's strategy sought not only conquest but also the ability to manage occupied regions efficiently, ensuring that resource extraction could begin almost immediately. Meanwhile, Allied forces in Malaya struggled to mount an effective counteroffensive. Communications were fragmented, reinforcements delayed, and the psychological impact of rapid Japanese advances undermined morale. Commanders attempted to regroup scattered units, establish defensive lines, and utilize local terrain to their advantage, but every delay played into Japanese hands. The invaders' combination of speed, coordination, and relentless pressure created an impression of invincibility, a perception Japan intended to cultivate not only to intimidate enemies but also to sustain national pride back home. Air supremacy was critical in these operations. Japanese pilots patrolled skies constantly, intercepting reconnaissance planes and preventing Allied forces from organizing counterattacks. Bombing raids targeted supply depots, bridges, and roads, severing logistical lines essential for resistance. The psychological effect was profound. Troops on the ground faced not only visible enemies but an omnipresent threat from above. Civilians, caught in the crossfire or witnessing the destruction of familiar towns and cities, were gripped by fear and uncertainty, further weakening potential resistance. The strategy was clear: dominance required both military control and psychological leverage. Naval operations remained equally vital. Destroyers patrolled nearby waters, ready to intercept any Allied vessels attempting to deliver reinforcements. Submarines prowled hidden routes, tracking movements, and ensuring supply lines remained uninterrupted. Aircraft carriers maintained a presence just beyond immediate engagement zones, allowing for rapid deployment of additional air support. Every vessel and crew member understood their role in a chain that extended from the deck of a battleship to the jungle depths inland. The precision of these operations reflected lessons learned from earlier campaigns and the meticulous planning that defined Japanese strategy in this era. As Japanese forces pushed inland, they encountered pockets of resistance. Small Allied units, supported by local militias, attempted to delay the advance, using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and sabotage. Yet each obstacle was met with calculated responses, flanking maneuvers, concentrated artillery strikes, and swift encirclements. Casualties were inevitable, but the emphasis on coordination and overwhelming firepower minimized disruptions to the larger campaign. The Japanese command viewed these skirmishes as both operational challenges and opportunities to demonstrate discipline and effectiveness to troops and observers alike. By the end of the first week, key objectives in northern Malaya had been secured. Airfields, ports, and towns fell under Japanese control, allowing immediate exploitation of resources and providing strategic footholds for further southward expansion. Soldiers, though exhausted, recognized the broader significance. Each captured location represented not only material gain but also a psychological victory. News of these rapid successes traveled back to Tokyo, reinforcing the narrative of a disciplined, unstoppable force, capable of achieving what seemed impossible just days before. The Philippines presented a more complex challenge. Its geography, with numerous islands and fortified positions, demanded careful planning and adaptability. Japanese commanders divided forces into multiple task groups, targeting both coastal cities and inland centers of resistance. Amphibious landings were synchronized with air attacks, while naval patrols secured sea lanes. Intelligence officers meticulously mapped terrain, anticipated enemy movements, and coordinated logistics to ensure sustained operations across a wide, dispersed area. Speed, again, was the essence of success. Prolonged engagements would allow Allied reinforcements to arrive and jeopardize the broader Pacific strategy. Throughout this campaign, the Japanese leadership emphasized morale as much as tactical achievement. Soldiers were reminded constantly that they were not merely fighting battles, they were advancing the destiny of an empire. Posters, radio broadcasts, and official communications framed the campaign as liberation from Western colonial powers, positioning Japanese forces as both conquerors and protectors. This dual narrative served multiple purposes: maintaining internal discipline, fostering national pride, and attempting to win support or at least compliance from local populations in newly occupied territories. By the close of Chapter 2, the march southward had achieved remarkable success. Malaya and the northern Philippines were largely under Japanese control, their ports and airfields operational, their resources poised for extraction. Allied forces had been delayed, scattered, and demoralized, while Japanese troops maintained cohesion, momentum, and a clear sense of purpose. The Pacific map was changing, and Japan's strategy, swift conquest, resource acquisition, and psychological dominance was demonstrating its effectiveness in real time. Yet commanders knew that sustaining these gains would require vigilance, adaptability, and the same relentless coordination that had carried them this far. The next stages of the campaign loomed, promising both new victories and unforeseen challenges as the empire pressed deeper into Southeast Asia. The domino of conquest. The winds over Singapore carried an uneasy stillness, as if the city itself sensed the storm approaching from the south. Japanese forces, riding the momentum of their victories in Malaya and the northern Philippines, now turned their attention to the crown jewel of British Southeast Asia. Singapore was not merely a city, it was a symbol of imperial power, a fortified bastion that had been deemed nearly impregnable. But symbols alone cannot withstand the relentless precision of a force moving with purpose, coordination, and an unyielding sense of destiny. Japanese commanders had studied the island meticulously. Every airfield, harbor, and defensive position was mapped. Engineers prepared for rapid demolition and repair work, ensuring that bridges, docks, and airstrips could be seized and utilized immediately. Infantry units were briefed on the terrain, mangrove swamps, river crossings, and fortified positions would require adaptive tactics rather than brute force. The lessons learned in Malaya amphibious landings, air support coordination, and rapid inland movement were now applied on a larger scale. At dawn, the first waves of Japanese troops approached from the southern coastline of the Malayan Peninsula, converging on Singapore from multiple directions. The roar of artillery preceded the landing, targeting coastal batteries and defensive fortifications. Fighter planes roared overhead, strafing positions and disrupting communications. Bombers followed, focusing on key military installations and supply depots. The objective was clear: create chaos, overwhelm defenses, and establish control before the British could mount an organized counter-offensive. Within hours, Japanese infantry were moving through the outskirts of Singapore with a methodical, almost mechanical precision. Engineers cleared obstacles and secured routes for armored units, while medics and supply personnel followed closely to ensure continuous operational capacity. The Japanese approach emphasized speed, coordination, and psychological dominance. Soldiers advanced with the knowledge that every port captured, every artillery position neutralized, and every airfield secured was a tangible step toward consolidating the empire's reach. On the ground, Allied forces faced a perfect storm. British, Indian, and Australian units attempted to organize defensive lines, but the rapidity of Japanese movements disrupted coordination. Communications were sporadic, reinforcements were delayed, and morale began to falter. Soldiers on the front lines were forced to contend with relentless air attacks, artillery bombardments, and flanking maneuvers that left them vulnerable and isolated. The psychological impact was as potent as the physical threat. An impression of invincibility spread through Allied ranks, further destabilizing resistance. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda worked in tandem with military operations. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and word-of-mouth messages framed the advance as liberation from Western colonial powers, portraying Japan as both conqueror and protector. Civilians were urged to cooperate, with the promise of safety and order under Japanese control. For the empire, this narrative served multiple purposes. It reinforced morale among soldiers, undermined Allied authority, and sought to stabilize newly occupied regions for resource extraction and logistical support. The campaign extended beyond Singapore. Japanese forces moved with coordinated efficiency into the Dutch East Indies, targeting oil-rich islands and critical infrastructure. Reconnaissance flights mapped enemy positions, while submarines patrolled key sea lanes to prevent reinforcements. Amphibious landings were executed on multiple islands simultaneously, with infantry and armored units advancing inland to secure airfields and ports. Engineers ensured supply chains remained functional, repairing bridges, clearing obstacles, and maintaining communication lines. The speed of conquest was remarkable. Each captured island represented not only material gain but also a psychological message: resistance was futile, and Japanese dominance was imminent. Air supremacy remained a cornerstone of operations. Japanese pilots conducted relentless sorties to neutralize enemy aircraft, attack supply depots, and provide cover for advancing ground forces. The presence of Japanese aircraft above strategic locations created a constant sense of vulnerability for Allied troops and civilians alike. Anti-aircraft defenses were often ineffective against the coordinated assault, further reinforcing the perception of Japanese invincibility. This combination of aerial, naval, and ground dominance allowed Japanese forces to maintain a tempo that the Allies struggled to counter. Within captured territories, Japanese administrators moved quickly to consolidate control. Civil governance was established to oversee resource extraction, infrastructure repair, and population management. Resistance movements were suppressed through intelligence operations, patrols, and swift punitive measures. The Japanese leadership understood that maintaining order was as critical as winning battles. Chaotic territories could jeopardize supply lines, hinder morale, and invite Allied counterattacks. Every decision was guided by a dual focus: operational efficiency and long-term strategic advantage. By the middle of 1942, the map of Southeast Asia had shifted dramatically. Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies were largely under Japanese control. Ports, airfields, and resource centers were operational, providing the empire with the fuel, rubber, and minerals necessary for sustaining further campaigns. Japanese propaganda celebrated the victories, both domestically and within newly occupied territories, portraying them as proof of an unassailable empire. Morale within the ranks soared, while the Allies were forced to reassess their strategy in the Pacific. However, the campaign was not without challenges. Tropical diseases, difficult terrain, and occasional guerrilla resistance slowed some operations. Coordination across distant islands required careful planning and logistical ingenuity. Commanders constantly adjusted strategies to meet unforeseen obstacles, emphasizing flexibility and adaptability as much as speed and aggression. Japanese forces learned to balance operational ambition with practical constraints, ensuring that rapid expansion did not overextend resources or compromise effectiveness. The domino effect of conquest was undeniable. Each captured territory facilitated the next advance, creating a chain of strategic victories that reshaped the Pacific theater. Allied forces were pushed back, supply lines disrupted, and morale tested. Japanese strategy, a combination of speed, coordination, psychological warfare, and resource acquisition, had transformed from theory into tangible results. The empire was no longer reacting, it was dictating the pace of events across Southeast Asia. As Japanese units secured the final objectives in early 1942, the focus began to shift toward consolidation and preparation for potential counterattacks. Each territory captured had to be governed, supplied, and defended against inevitable Allied attempts to reclaim lost ground. The lessons from Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies informed the approach. Dominance required not just rapid conquest but also careful management of occupied regions, ensuring both operational efficiency and long-term strategic advantage. The march of the Japanese Empire had reshaped the Pacific map in a matter of months. From the beaches of Malaya to the ports of the Dutch East Indies, victories were achieved not solely through brute force but through meticulous planning, coordinated execution, and psychological mastery. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike were swept into a narrative of inevitability. Japan was ascendant, the Allies were reactive, and the empire's destiny seemed within reach. Yet the vastness of the Pacific and the resilience of Allied powers ensured that the next phase of the war would test these hard-won gains in ways that no map or plan could fully predict. Consolidation and resistance. The sun rose over the newly captured territories of Southeast Asia with an eerie calm, as if the islands themselves were holding their breath. Japanese forces, after a rapid string of victories from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies, now faced a different challenge: turning conquest into lasting control. Battles had been won, ports secured, airfields operational, and resources flowing, but the real test was maintaining authority across vast, unfamiliar landscapes while anticipating the inevitable counter-offensive from the Allies. Commanders convened in hastily constructed field headquarters to assess the next phase. Maps covered tables, dotted with pins marking captured cities, supply depots, and forward positions. Officers discussed not just troop movements but infrastructure repairs, civilian cooperation, and intelligence gathering. The speed of conquest had been a tactical marvel, but consolidation required patience, meticulous planning, and a balance between strict discipline and strategic leniency. The line between oppression and administration had to be navigated carefully. Alienating local populations could undermine the very gains won at such high cost. In Malaya, towns and cities bore the scars of battle. Roads had been damaged by artillery fire, bridges destroyed, and supply depots looted or bombed. Japanese engineers worked feverishly to restore transportation networks, clear debris, and repair docks, enabling the steady flow of troops, weapons, and raw materials. Infantry units patrolled the streets, sometimes engaging remnants of Allied resistance or local militias. Every action was designed to reinforce the perception of order and control, demonstrating that Japanese dominance was both efficient and unyielding. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, became a central hub for administration and military operations. Commanders established offices to oversee resource management, food distribution, and the coordination of reinforcements. Japanese officers emphasized discipline and vigilance. The city's civilian population was closely monitored, with curfews, travel restrictions, and registration requirements. Propaganda campaigns, carefully designed to portray the Japanese as liberators rather than conquerors, were implemented across newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public posters. The psychological component of governance was as vital as logistical control, shaping both perception and compliance. Yet resistance simmered beneath the surface. Small Allied contingents, retreating from front lines, began organizing guerrilla operations, using dense jungles and hidden valleys to launch surprise attacks on supply lines and patrols. Local civilians, torn between survival and loyalty, sometimes provided intelligence, shelter, or material support to the resistors. Japanese forces responded with a mixture of caution and aggression: reconnaissance missions, counterinsurgency patrols, and punitive measures aimed at deterring further opposition. The interplay of conquest and rebellion created a tense equilibrium, a constant test of authority and adaptability. Intelligence gathering became a cornerstone of consolidation. Spies, informants, and intercepted communications provided insights into potential uprisings, Allied plans, and civilian sentiment. Japanese officers utilized this information to preempt disruptions, reposition troops, and refine supply routes. Coordination between military intelligence and field units ensured rapid response to threats, minimizing the risk of localized rebellions escalating into larger strategic problems. The emphasis on information as power reflected a broader understanding: territorial control was meaningless without situational awareness and timely decision-making. Resource extraction was another critical priority. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, rubber, and minerals, became the backbone of Japan's logistical network. Engineers repaired oil refineries and mining facilities, while supply chains were organized to transport raw materials to ports for shipment. Coastal towns became collection points for agricultural products, timber, and other essentials. Each captured resource contributed not only to sustaining Japanese forces but also to reinforcing the empire's strategic leverage across the Pacific. The careful management of these assets transformed initial conquest into long-term operational advantage. Civilians navigated a new reality under occupation. While propaganda framed Japanese forces as liberators, many locals experienced strict regulations, forced labor, and limited access to resources. Daily life became a delicate balance of compliance and survival, with communities seeking ways to maintain cultural and economic stability under foreign control. Schools, markets, and administrative offices functioned under new rules, often staffed by Japanese supervisors, blending military oversight with civil bureaucracy. The occupied territories became microcosms of an empire striving to impose order while fending off both overt and covert resistance. Naval and air operations continued to play a vital role in consolidation. Patrols ensured that sea lanes remained secure from Allied incursions, while reconnaissance flights monitored the movement of hostile forces and potential uprisings. Aircraft were stationed strategically to provide rapid response in case of rebellion or counterattack. Coordination between land, sea, and air units maintained a protective envelope around newly captured territories, reinforcing Japanese control and deterring both military and civilian challenges to authority. As weeks turned into months, Allied counter-strategies began to materialize. American, British, and Australian forces regrouped in distant strongholds, launching air raids, naval bombardments, and limited amphibious operations to test Japanese defenses. Intelligence leaks, sabotage, and guerrilla tactics created persistent, if localized, disruptions. Japanese commanders responded with layered defensive strategies, rotating troops, and fortifying key positions. The delicate balance between defending conquered territory and preparing for the next offensive became the defining challenge of the consolidation phase. Psychological factors remained central. Japanese leadership maintained morale among troops through ceremonies, awards, and reinforcing narratives of victory and destiny. Soldiers were reminded that they were part of a historical movement, advancing the empire's reach while defending honor and national pride. This emphasis on ideology strengthened cohesion, ensured obedience, and provided motivation amidst the monotony and danger of occupation duties. By mid-1942, the territories under Japanese control were largely stabilized. Ports were operational, supply chains established, and key military installations fortified. Allied forces were regrouping in the Pacific, preparing for counter-offensives that would eventually challenge the empire's dominance. Yet for the moment, Japan maintained a vast, strategically valuable empire stretching from the Malayan Peninsula to the Dutch East Indies, a testament to meticulous planning, coordination, and disciplined execution. The campaign's success highlighted an important lesson: conquest alone was insufficient. Effective governance, intelligence, logistics, psychological operations, and counter-resistance measures were all essential components of sustaining an empire. Japanese forces had moved with speed and precision, but it was the deliberate, calculated effort to consolidate control that would determine the long-term impact of their campaign. The war was far from over, and the challenges ahead would test every lesson learned in months of rapid conquest. In the shadows of newly captured cities and jungles, resistance persisted, and Allied counter-efforts were taking shape. The battlefields of Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had shifted from open combat to a complex struggle of administration, subterfuge, and psychological warfare. Japan's achievements in rapid conquest were impressive, but maintaining an empire required a constant balance between military strength, strategic